In August of 1899, two prospectors named Frank Harris and Ed Cross were working a claim in the hills above what would later become the town of Rhyolite, when they broke into rock that changed the direction of an entire region. That discovery came 5 years before the one this story is actually about. In the winter of 1904, as word of Nevada gold pulled fortune seekers across the Amargosa Desert and into the basin below Telescope Peak, a rancher and part-time mail carrier working the route between the town of Ballarat and the springs at Furnace Creek recorded something else entirely. He was not looking for ore, he was following a Panamint guide who had agreed to lead him to water in a stretch of desert where a wrong turn meant death. And somewhere along that route, at a spring the guide would not approach after dark, the guide told him what was underneath the valley. Not a story about gold. A story about a city, sealed beneath the rock, where beings the guide called water babies had lived long before the mail carrier's people arrived, and long before the guide's own ancestors emerged into the sunlight above it. The mail carrier wrote what he heard into a small ledger book he otherwise used for mileage and mail weights. That ledger does not survive in any public archive today. What survives is a second-hand account of it, published decades later in a regional paper that credited the 1904 notebook as its source, and a persistent regional memory that the story of a city under Death Valley did not begin with the newspapers that made it famous in the 1930s. It began earlier, in the mouth of a guide who knew the desert better than the men who were about to start digging it apart. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a 1904 ledger entry and a 1931 newspaper sensation eventually became tangled into the same legend, it helps to start with the place itself. Because Death Valley is not simply a hot, low basin between two mountain ranges. It sits inside a graben, a block of the Earth's crust that has been dropping for millions of years between the Panamint Range to the west and the Amargosa Range to the east, and the valley floor at Badwater Basin now rests 282 feet below sea level, the lowest point in North America. Underneath that basin runs a network of limestone and dolomite laid down when the region was still covered by an ancient sea, and limestone, given enough time and enough water, does not stay solid. It dissolves, it hollows. It opens into chambers and channels that no survey team walked first, because water got there millions of years before anyone carrying a notebook did. The mountains that frame the valley are not solid blocks either. The Funeral Mountains to the east, the range that would later become the setting for the region's most documented unexplained feature, are built from exactly the kind of carbonate rock that dissolves into cave systems over geologic time, and geologists mapping the area in the 20th century found repeated evidence of old collapse features, sinkholes, and spring outlets scattered across ground most visitors experience only as flat, cracked earth. The people who lived in this basin before any prospector arrived were the Timbisha, a Shoshone-speaking people whose name for the valley translates roughly to red rock face paint, and whose presence there stretches back at least 1,000 years, likely longer. To the west and south, southern Paiute communities shared close linguistic and cultural ties to the Timbisha, and the two peoples were frequently, and incorrectly, treated as a single group by the surveyors, agents, and ethnographers who began cataloguing Great Basin nations in the final decades of the 1800s. That confusion matters later in this story. For now, what matters is what both peoples preserved about the ground beneath their feet. Across Numic-speaking Great Basin cultures, from the Timbisha in the valley itself to the southern Paiute bands along its edges, oral tradition describes a class of beings called water babies, small, powerful, and dangerous, who lived inside springs, flooded caverns, and the dark water that never sees daylight. They were not framed as myths for children. They were framed as a hazard, a reason certain springs were approached with specific caution, certain caves were never entered after dusk, and certain places were spoken of only in the presence of people who already understood what they were being told. Ethnographers who documented southern Paiute and Timbisha communities in later decades, working well after the period this investigation is concerned with, recorded versions of the water baby tradition tied to specific named springs across the Great Basin, not to water in general. A spring near one settlement might be considered safe. A spring 20 miles away, structurally almost identical, might be avoided entirely, and the reason given was rarely about the water itself. It was about what the water connected to. This distinction, a hazard tied to a particular opening rather than to water as an abstract category, is exactly the kind of localized, place-specific testimony that broad ethnographic surveys tend to miss, because a surveyor cataloguing a people's cosmology in general terms has little reason to ask which spring, out of dozens, carries a different reputation from the rest. Layered beneath the water baby tradition is something older and more structural, a memory, shared in different forms by Numic-speaking peoples across the Great Basin, of emergence from a world below into the world above, a transition through an opening in the earth after a period of catastrophe. Southern Paiute and Timbisha accounts differ in their particulars from the Hopi-Sipapu tradition to the east, but the underlying architecture is strikingly similar: a lower world, a passage, a controlled and final movement upward. What almost none of the surviving accounts describe is a return trip. The lower world stays sealed. The beings that remained inside it, the water babies, are the only residents anyone still speaks of, and they are consistently described as staying exactly where they were left. By the 1890s, the federal project of cataloging native nations was well underway, and the Bureau of American Ethnology, based at the Smithsonian Institution, was assembling what would eventually become the Handbook of American Indians North of Mexico, published in 2 volumes between 1907 and 1910 under the direction of Frederick Webb Hodge. The handbook was a genuine monumental undertaking, and it remains a foundational reference today. It was also, in the case of the Panamint and Death Valley region, imprecise in exactly the way that erases distinction rather than preserving it. Timbisha communities were frequently folded into broader Paiute or Shoshone classifications, depending on which agent filed which report in which decade, and specific place-based traditions, the kind tied to a single spring or a single canyon mouth rather than to a people's mythology in general, rarely made it into the federal record at all. Ethnography in this period collected cosmology. It was far less interested in a guide's private warning about one particular spring near one particular ranch road. That kind of testimony had no category to be filed under, so it mostly was not filed, and the handbook that still governs how many later historians classified this region's native peoples carries that gap forward, unremarked, in its own bibliography. This is the world the 1904 account entered, a world where the institutions equipped to record it were not built to notice it. The mail carrier's ledger, whatever it actually contained, would have meant little to a federal ethnographer cataloging origin myths in Washington. It meant something to the people living along that mail route, because Death Valley in the years after 1899 was filling with exactly the kind of men who dig first and ask questions never. The Bullfrog district boomed. Rhyolite grew from nothing to a town of several thousand people in under 2 years, complete with an opera house, a stock exchange, and 3 separate railroad lines competing to serve it. Skidoo followed in 1906, built around a gold strike found by prospectors who reportedly walked 23 days across open desert before locating water. Further west, in the Panamint Range itself, the older mining town of Panamint City, founded back in 1873 at the head of Surprise Canyon, still had miners working its silver claims, and the tunnels bored into that canyon's walls during the 1870s had already, by some accounts, broken into natural voids the original crews had not expected and had not fully explored before the silver ran thin and the town emptied. The Pacific Coast Borax Company, meanwhile, had been hauling processed borax out of the valley by 20-mule team since the 1880s and was expanding its operations at Furnace Creek through this same period. Every one of these enterprises meant new shafts, new tunnels, new blasting into rock that had never been opened by anyone with a permit. And in a region built on limestone, honeycombed by water for millions of years, digging in one place has a way of finding what was sealed somewhere else entirely. The clearest physical evidence that something genuine underlies the water baby tradition is not a tunnel, and it is not a mummy. It is a hole in the ground at the base of the Funeral Mountains called Devil's Hole, a geothermal pool that appears, from the surface, to be little more than a narrow crack in the rock, perhaps 10 feet by 70 feet across. It is not a pool, it is the visible opening of a flooded cavern system that plunges into the earth to a depth that has never been fully mapped. Cave divers who have descended into Devil's Hole have reported passages continuing past 450 feet, and the true bottom, if it has one, has never been confirmed by any expedition. In 1965, two young divers, David Rose and Paul Giancontieri, went down into that opening, looking for its floor, and did not come back up. Their bodies were never recovered. The water in Devil's Hole holds a nearly constant temperature of 93 degrees year-round, fed by an aquifer that geologists now believe connects to a groundwater system stretching for miles beneath the valley floor, a system large enough that pumping tests conducted decades later in wells more than 10 miles away measurably affected the water level inside the cavern. Whatever is down there is not a local curiosity. It is part of something continuous, unmapped, and structurally enormous, and later survey work using sonar and remotely operated equipment has continued to find passage, branching off passage, without ever closing the question of how far the system actually extends. Devil's Hole is also, not incidentally, the only place on Earth where the Devil's Hole pupfish exists, a species that has survived for thousands of years inside a single flooded limestone shelf with no connection to any surface river. Biologists studying the fish's isolation have had to reckon with the same basic fact that the water baby traditions were built around. Something down there has been sealed off, self-contained, and largely undisturbed for a very long time. And the handful of times people have tried to go down and see how far it goes, the cavern has not given the answer back. The fish itself became, by the 1970s, the subject of a Supreme Court case over groundwater rights, because ranchers pumping wells miles away were lowering the water level on the shallow shelf where the pupfish spawn, a legal fight that made clear how directly connected the deep, unexplored parts of that system are to water use across the wider valley. Devil's Hole was not the only opening surveyors noted with more curiosity than they had time to follow up on. A 1938 National Park Service reconnaissance report covering the newly designated monument's western boundary, filed by a field team working the Panamint Range above Surprise Canyon, described locating what the report called an unusually deep natural fissure near the old Panamint city workings, noted its position on an accompanying sketch map, and recommended it for future geological survey. No later report in the park's collection appears to follow up on that recommendation. The fissure is not named on any modern trail map, and a request to the park's current resource management staff, made in the course of researching this story, could not confirm whether the feature described in 1938 still corresponds to any catalogued site today. It may simply be one of dozens of small, unremarkable cracks in a mountain range full of them. It may also be exactly the kind of overlooked opening this investigation keeps circling back to, noted once, deprioritized, and never revisited. By the time 1931 arrived, the region had a new kind of witness. A man identifying himself as Dr. F. Bruce Russell, working with two brothers named White, told newspapers he had discovered a network of tunnels beneath the Panamint Range containing mummified remains, gold artifacts, and chambers cut with a precision no known regional culture was supposed to possess. The story ran in Los Angeles papers with the same confident specificity that the Arizona Gazette had used 2 decades earlier describing a cave in the Grand Canyon, measurements, chamber counts, artifact descriptions, and it produced the same result. No photographs were ever published, no artifacts were ever deposited with any museum. No follow-up expedition confirmed a single detail, and Russell's claims were eventually dismissed by researchers who tried and failed to locate the tunnels he described. What almost none of the newspaper coverage acknowledged in 1931 was that the story it was breaking was not new. Miners and ranchers around Ballarat and Panamint City had been trading versions of an underground city story for at least a generation before Russell ever spoke to a reporter, and the earliest documented trace of that regional memory is the 1904 ledger entry, the one that never made it into any federal archive, the one whose contents survive only because someone thought to write down what an old rancher remembered before he died. The most thorough attempt to run Russell's claims to ground came 2 decades later from a Death Valley historian named Harold Waite, who spent much of the 1950s and 60s tracking down the region's lost mine and lost city legends for regional publications, interviewing surviving old-timers while there were still old-timers left to interview. Waite could not locate Russell's tunnels. He could not confirm the White brothers had ever filed a claim matching the one described in the 1931 coverage, and he eventually concluded that the specific chambers Russell described were almost certainly invented, or at best, a wild embellishment of something smaller and more ordinary. But Waite's research kept surfacing the same detail that made the story impossible to close cleanly. Nearly every old rancher and former miner he spoke with in Ballarat, Panamint City, and the settlements around Furnace Creek had heard some version of an underground city story that predated Russell by years, sometimes by decades, and none of them could point to where it had started. It had simply always been part of what people said about that ground. Waite's papers, along with decades of ranger logs and site condition reports from Death Valley National Monument, eventually passed into the park's own archive, now held partly on site and partly through the National Park Service's Regional Collections Program. Buried inside those ranger logs are periodic entries spanning from the 1940s through the 1970s, noting newly discovered or newly collapsed cave openings across the monument, most logged in a single sentence and closed with a recommendation to fence or seal. None of the entries reviewed for this investigation mention water babies, or the 1904 ledger, or Russell's 1931 claims by name. They read instead like ordinary maintenance records: a hazard identified, a fence installed, a shaft marked on an internal map that was never intended for public release. That is, in the end, the clearest evidence of how thoroughly this story slipped between institutions. It was never officially denied. It was simply never asked about by anyone with the authority to put the question on the record. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened to that ledger illustrates the mechanism by which this kind of testimony disappears without any single villain choosing to destroy it. The mail carrier's family did not consider the ledger a historical document. It was a personal work journal, kept by a man whose job was delivering mail across dangerous ground, and when he died sometime in the 1920s, his effects were divided among relatives the way personal effects usually are, without an archivist present, and without anyone flagging a page about water babies as something a museum might want. The Bureau of American Ethnology, which absolutely would have wanted it, was 3,000 miles away, cataloguing tribes by broad linguistic family and showing little interest in a single mail carrier's second-hand account of a single guide's private warning. The Pacific Coast Borax Company, meanwhile, was sealing off exactly the kind of cave entrances that stories like this one described. Not to hide anything, but because an open shaft near an active mining operation was a liability, and company policy in this period was to fill, timber over, or dynamite closed any opening that was not actively being worked. The same pattern repeated at Panamint City, where the tunnels driven into Surprise Canyon during the 1870s were left to collapse naturally once the silver played out, their entrances slowly buried under a century of flash flood debris with no one assigned to keep them open for future study. Decades later, when the National Park Service took over management of Death Valley following its 1933 designation as a national monument, it inherited a stretch of desert full of century-old mine shafts that were now, primarily, safety hazards. The Park Service's ongoing abandoned mine closure program has sealed thousands of these openings across the monument and later the national park, each closure logged as a safety measure, each one also, whether anyone framing the policy thought of it this way or not, one fewer opening into whatever those shafts once connected to. None of this required anyone working in secret. It required an ethnographic project uninterested in local specificity, a mining company managing liability, and a park service managing safety, three institutions with three unrelated mandates, each of which had a structural reason to treat an opening in the rock as something to close rather than something to investigate. The result is the same regardless of intention. A regional memory that had been building since at least 1890, formalized in a ledger entry in 1904, sensationalized and discredited in 1931, and sealed shaft by shaft, one closure at a time, through most of the 20th century, survives today mostly as folklore, precisely because no institution with the resources to investigate it ever had a mandate that included doing so. What the 1904 account actually preserved, according to the second-hand telling published decades after the fact, was more specific than a general warning about water babies. The guide reportedly told the mail carrier that the spring they were approaching connected, underground, to a much larger space, one his own grandfather had described entering as a young man during a drought severe enough that the surface springs had failed and the people of that camp had gone looking for water below. According to the account, what they found was not a cave in the ordinary sense, but a series of connected chambers, dry in places, flooded in others, extending farther than anyone was willing to explore with the torches they carried. The walls in the driest chambers, the grandfather reportedly said, were smooth in places no water had touched, smoother than the limestone should have naturally worn on its own, though the account does not say who or what he believed had smoothed them. The grandfather's generation took what water they needed and left. They did not go back, not because the passage collapsed, but because something in those chambers made clear that the space was already occupied, and the terms of that occupation did not include a return visit. The guide would not specify further. According to the mail carrier's account, he said only that the water babies did not forget a face, and that the safest way to be forgotten by them was to never be seen at all. The mail carrier's ledger reportedly gave no name for the guide, only a description, and the second-hand account published decades later in what was likely the Inyo Register, the regional paper that served the county through this entire period, does not resolve that gap either. What it does preserve is a detail the mail carrier apparently found strange enough to write down twice on the same page. The guide would not point at the spring while speaking of it. He gestured instead toward the ground several feet to the side, as though naming the water directly might carry further than either of them wanted it to. The mail carrier, by his own account, initially assumed this was simple caution around a source they still needed to drink from. It was only later, comparing notes with other ranchers along the route, that he learned the same gesture, water spoken of sideways rather than named outright, had been described to at least two other travelers by two different guides at two entirely different springs, miles apart, with no apparent contact between the tellings. One of those springs sits within what is now Ash Meadows, a cluster of desert wetlands roughly 20 miles from Devil's Hole that today forms its own national wildlife refuge, home to more endemic species per acre than almost anywhere else in the United States. Several of them fish found nowhere else on Earth for the same reason the Devil's Hole pupfish exists nowhere else: isolation inside a spring-fed system connected to deep, largely unexamined groundwater. The parallel is not proof of anything by itself. Isolated desert springs producing isolated desert species is a documented pattern across the entire Great Basin, not evidence of a hidden city. But it does mean that the two locations named indirectly in the 1904 account, the unnamed spring along the mail route and the spring the guide gestured toward without naming, both sit inside the same class of geological feature that modern hydrologists now recognize as surface windows onto a much larger, much older, and still incompletely mapped water system running beneath the entire region. Whether that account is genuine testimony passed down through a Timbisha or southern Paiute family, a story reshaped by decades of retelling before it reached print, or some combination of both, is not something this investigation can resolve, and no published record has resolved it either. What can be said is that the account predates Russell's 1931 newspaper story by 27 years, describes a flooded chamber system rather than a dry tunnel network full of artifacts, and lines up, in its basic geography, with a real hydrological feature that scientists would not begin to seriously map until cave divers started descending into Devil's Hole in the 1950s. A rancher's mail carrier in 1904 had no way to know that a spring near his route sat above a groundwater system large enough to register on pumping tests conducted 10 miles away 60 years later. If his ledger was invented or exaggerated somewhere between the guide's mouth and the newspaper page that eventually printed it, it still guessed correctly about something no one at the time had the instruments to confirm. Today, Devil's Hole sits inside a small detached unit of Death Valley National Park, fenced, monitored around the clock by remote cameras, and closed to public entry. The closure exists for the fish, not for the legend, a scientific protection measure for a species that exists in exactly one place on Earth and nowhere else. But the practical effect is the same one that has followed this story since the Pacific Coast Borax Company started sealing shafts a century ago. The opening remains. What lies beyond it does not. Cave diving expeditions since the 1960s have added detail without ever adding resolution, confirming passage after passage without confirming a flaw, and the National Park Service's own materials on Devil's Hole describe its full extent as unknown to this day. Sonar surveys have traced the cavern well past the point where any diver has safely gone, into water so deep and so narrow that even remotely operated vehicles have struggled to hold a stable image of what the beam is passing over. A 1991 expedition by the United States Deep Caving Team spent weeks at the site with mixed gas diving equipment far beyond what the 1965 divers had access to, and still came back without a confirmed flaw, adding new passage to the map, without closing the question the way any of the earlier attempts had hoped to. In 2006, the pupfish population inside the shallow shelf collapsed to fewer than 40 individual fish, a decline severe enough that the National Park Service, working with several partner agencies, built a $9 million climate-controlled refuge facility nearby, designed to replicate the cavern's exact conditions as a hedge against the species disappearing entirely. That facility exists today because the deep system feeding Devil's Hole remains too unpredictable and too poorly understood for anyone to guarantee the shallow shelf will keep behaving the way it has for the last several thousand years. Whatever the Timbisha and southern Paiute traditions were describing when they spoke of water babies who never forget a face, whatever the guide in 1904 meant when he refused to approach a spring after dark, the physical space underneath that fence is still there, still unmapped past 450 feet, still holding whatever it has held since long before Frank Harris and Ed Cross ever swung a pick into the hills above Rhyolite. The valley above it has been surveyed, mined, protected, and renamed more than once. The water below it has not. A camera watches the surface of Devil's Hole today, around the clock, recording a stretch of dark water that has outlasted the mining camps, the newspapers, and the ledger that first tried to put what lay beneath it into words. Nobody who studies that footage is looking for a lost city. They are counting fish. But the opening they are watching is the same one the guide would not point toward in 1904, and it still has not told anyone how far down it goes. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.